Hello and welcome back. Thank you for stopping by and visiting my discussion of COVID-19. It's March 21st, which I think means spring is here. Um, Happy spring. Today's Johns Hopkins dashboard, when I grabbed this one, I believe, yeah, here it is, 1:43 p.m. Italy's now over 50,000 cases and 5,000 deaths. That's a very stark and scary number. Spain is at 25,000, 1,300 deaths, and so forth. It's been in the news quite a bit. This was a newspaper article about Italy getting over the 4,000 fatality mark. This is a clip from I think it's an NBC video showing how the hospitals are overcrowded in Italy right now. This room, when they panned the room, I think there were 8 beds of patients that needed some sort of significant oxygen and ventilation therapy, um, and uh, and there were a handful of nurses and doctors clearly working incredibly hard to deal with that heavy load. Um, the U.S. This was, I guess it was Microsoft News that showed this to me. You know, there's a quote attributed to Stalin that probably actually predates him, which is that one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And when we start throwing these numbers around, it just becomes mind boggling, and we forget there's a single human behind each of these. So, this is just 4 individual pictures of 4 people in the US that have already died from COVID 19. Um, I read about them, but I'm not going to go into their stories. So I just wanted to remind us that as the numbers get larger, it becomes more and more clinical, um, kind of mathematical and less personal. But there's a lot of personal stories behind all these numbers. The NIH had said we could have 70,000 cases by next Friday. That's in 6 days from now. I think we're going to beat that, but we'll see. What else has been in the news? There's been some discussions about Trump, who is now in a wartime stance. He's talked about being a wartime president. Remember, he was the one who was at CDC 2 weeks ago and said he had a hunch this wasn't going to be a big deal. He argued that there was just a feeling that the anti-malaria drug could cure the coronavirus, yet there's no evidence yet. He complained he's not been credited with fixing a nationwide testing system, but it's clearly still broken. We're still doing the worst job of testing of any developed nation. Trump claimed that he felt it was a pandemic long before it was called a pandemic. He declared on Tuesday. 5 days earlier, he said it's going to go away. And 2 days earlier than that, so 7 days before he was sure he had called the pandemic first, he said, it'll go away, just stay calm. So he's changed his tune now that it's become clear how significant it is. But until very recently, he was mocking the concern about this, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. So now I'm going to show a couple of the published papers that have come out. It's actually been really amazing how fast these papers have come out and helped us understand COVID-19. This is a paper showing the cumulative days since infection and when somebody shows symptoms. So this is based on publicly available records, and each of these is an individual. There's a whole bunch of them, and what you're seeing here is the probability of you showing symptoms on day 0 is 0, and by day about 14, if you're going to show symptoms, you've shown symptoms. This middle line here is the statistical estimate. So the median, which is the 50th percentile, is 5 days. Down here, the 10th percentile is 3 days. So 10% of the people show symptoms before 3 days. This is the 90th percentile, gets down to 8, 9-ish days. So that means that 10% of the people on the other end don't show symptoms till at least the 8th day, maybe the 9th day. Turns out they did some of their statistical estimation, and the 97.5th percentile up here, where only 2.5% of the people showed symptoms beyond that, was at 11.5 days. So if you're going to capture the window when symptoms could occur, it's really 3 to 8. It gets 80% of the population. If you want 95%, you have to go from 2 to more than 11 days. So it can be a long time. Another paper published in February on January data from Wuhan and Hubei province, and they're looking here at of the cases. The first case, they say, apparently was discovered around December 1st or 5th or something, and there was almost no growth in cases that was significant until after the market closure into the new year. This was the only chance we probably ever had to stop this thing. And they're showing here the distribution in age of the Chinese population, cases, deaths, and so forth, in order to create a couple of graphics. This is interesting because green here are the symptomatic patients, and blue here is the overall, because there's also some asymptomatic cases they think that are going on. And then because they were looking only at a small sampling window, some of the individuals that were sick at the time they cut the study to get it published would eventually potentially die. So they did a bunch of mathematical modeling to account for that. And let me show you what they found. They found that age was a significant predictor of mortality. We've said that all along. The unadjusted case fatality ratio, which is taking the raw numbers like I'm doing from Italy, where I say today this many died and this many have the case, is not a very sophisticated method. That would have been 2.4% in their population, and they believe it was really 1.6% when they did the adjustments. When you look at the age ranges below 40, it's still it's even lower than this. So, and they're adjusted and in raw, they agree pretty well. If you're less than 50, you have about a 0.4% chance of dying if you become symptomatic. If you're 50 to 60, it's 1.3%. If you're 60 to 69, it's close to 5%. And as you hit 70 to 79, it's now 10%. And it goes up from there. So really, the danger is 60 plus, 70 plus being even more so. This is a really interesting paper that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine about transmission from an asymptomatic contact in Germany. There was a businessman from Wuhan who had come from Hubei, from Wuhan, that had come to China for a meeting and left. Developed his symptoms after he left. Actually, I don't know if it's him or her. Developed their symptoms after they left. 2 individuals who had direct contact with them came down with the disease. And then 2 more people that had contact with those 2 individuals also came down with the disease. But the speed at which this happened is remarkable. So here's the attending to the meetings for the index patient, the person from Wuhan. It's these 3 days, January 19th through 21st. On the 20th and 21st, that person interacted with patient 1. And on the 21st, that person interacted with patient 2. This person developed symptoms basically on the flight home on the 22nd of January. Symptoms developed in patient 1 and patient 2, these gray things, on the 24th and the 25th. So only 2 or 3 days later, which is about as early as they typically show. These pluses are when all of these were confirmed to be COVID-19 through PCR. But the thing is, patient 3 and 4 never had any contact with the index patient. They had contact with patient 1. And they had contact on these times where it says C before patient 1 themselves was symptomatic. Patient 4 had contact with patient 1 the day before patient 1 became symptomatic. That shouldn't shock us. But patient 3, their last contact with patient 1 was like 24 hours after the person was exposed to the virus, maybe 36, and they picked up the virus as well, and they became symptomatic very shortly thereafter, so 1 or 2 days behind patient number 1. So we became symptomatic on January 22nd with our index patient, the 24th with the 2 direct contacts, and the 25th and 26th with second generation contacts. So that spread from 1 to 2 to 4 in the matter of 4 days. That's how rapid it spreads. Another really fascinating paper, this is published in the Journal of the American Medical Association. There's a whole lot going on, so I'm going to break it down into a couple of things. Each of these is a case in Singapore. Their arrival in Singapore is here. Their symptoms, light green is symptoms without fever, dark green is symptoms with fever, blue means no symptoms, and then yellow, orange, red mean bad symptoms. And what I've shown here is the folks that needed to be in intensive care or with supplemental oxygen. So 19 patients hospitalized, 5 of them needed oxygen. That's 1 in 4, right? So 25%-ish. And 2 of the 19 patients, that I show here needed critical care, intensive care. And so these yellow stripes are the oxygen, and then there's a patch here where they had been on oxygen and they had to go into the ICU for several days. And here they're in the ICU for several days. Each of these little squares is a day. So this is 8 days in the ICU and 11 days on oxygen. This is also something like 10 days on oxygen. This is, I don't know what that is, 2 weeks on oxygen. So these are not trivial things. There's some other information about this, which is, I think, fascinating. And one of them is the admitted to the hospital date, which is that big plus sign. And then the other is, did they test for shedding of the virus? Could they detect virus particles on a throat swab or other ways? And you'll see throughout all of these cases, when they got admitted to the hospital, they were nearly always symptomatic. There's one case here, just one out of the 16 I'm showing you, where they didn't detect the virus particle until 3 days later. But I want to show you a couple of these. Let's look at patient 8. They got tested for the virus the day before they were admitted. They were admitted, no testing that day. Then there were 6 days in a row where they were symptomatic and tested positive. And then 8 more days where they were still shedding virus but symptom free. They tested free of the virus, and then they tested for 2 more days shedding virus. You'll see that down here as well. I didn't fill in all of these because it took a while. But what you'll see is that shedding virus particles happens right up front when you're sick. We think even before you're sick. That had to have been the case for the German example because the person was asymptomatic. And you shed particles during that whole time you're sick, typically. And actually, several days or a week often into your period where you're asymptomatic. So that's a very long time to be infectious. This is a modeling study that was done recently. It was published, today's the 21st, 5 days ago by some very well-respected epidemiological modelers. This came out of Imperial College in London. They're showing, for example, some of the parameters they used for the model. I just wanted to show you this because they went through all the information they could gather in the last 6 weeks and said that what's the chance that a percent symptomatic case would require hospitalization? If you're 20 to 29, it's about a 1 in 100 chance you're going to need to be hospitalized. If you're 50 like I am, 55, 57, whatever it is, I have a 10% chance of needing hospitalization if I get this. And if it's somebody in their 80s, they have more than 25% chance. Now we look at what percentage of hospitalized cases require critical care. So if I'm one of these 20-year-olds who gets hospitalized, I've only got a 1 in 20 chance of needing critical care. But someone my age has a 10% chance of needing to be hospitalized and a 12% chance of requiring intensive care. So I have a 1 in 8 chance of needing intensive care treatment if I'm in the hospital at my age, and somebody older is nearly certain to need ICU treatment. And then when you look at the infection fatality ratio all the way across this, we're well below 1% until we hit just about 50, where you approach 1%, and then 2, and then 5, and then 9. And just so you know, I think influenza is often quoted as having something like 0.01% or 0.1%, somewhere in there, in case fatality ratio. So even this 40 or 49-year number is significantly higher than most influenzas, and this gets extremely high. So then they modeled, okay, let's try some things and see in our model what can happen in terms of the caseload. So this is their epidemics. They have 5 colored curves showing epidemics, and each of them involves one or more interventions. The black line at the top is no intervention at all, just let it rip. And they're showing the number of critical care beds occupied, critical care beds per 100,000 in the population. So it gets really high. So we want to know how high 270 is compared to their surge capacity. And I missed this the first time around. What's their surge critical bed capacity? Oh my gosh, it's this red line down here. So there is nothing that brings these curves anywhere near the red line. We're going to exceed surge. So the green line after the do nothing, which is black, is closing schools and universities. You see a very modest decrease in the severity of the peak and a tiny delay. What if we just isolate cases? That causes a larger drop and a slightly longer delay. But still, we're more than 3/4 up to it really didn't bring us down by more than a quarter or a third. Now, when we quarantine household members, as soon as we identify a case, we start getting more effective because if I come home with it and I'm sick and they quarantine me, but my family goes out, they're going to get it from me very likely. And they're going to go out when they're asymptomatic and they're going to give it to other people. So if a person has this disease, you need to quarantine the entire uh, living group, family group that's with that person to not spread it. And then finally, in blue, if we do case isolation, home quarantine, and social distances, particularly protecting seniors over 70, we can slow this down by maybe 2/3. But under no scenario did we slow it down to get anywhere near surge capacity. We're still many times higher than surge capacity, and that's always been the concern. And so I started this morning, this afternoon, actually at 1:43. It's now 4:43, at least for the date stamp on the Johns Hopkins website when they last updated it. And we went by it pretty quickly, but there were 297,000 cases confirmed at 1:43 p.m. 3 hours ago. So in 3 hours, based on the timestamp of the Johns Hopkins real-time data tracker, we got 2,000 cases per hour, 6,000 cases in 3 hours. We also got about 200 deaths. So we're recording about 60 deaths per hour, so a death every minute right now. And we're still in the very early phases of this pandemic. So it's brutal. And I wanted to say thank you for the lovely comments some of you have left. I care passionately about the science. I want people to understand how serious this is because I think that's the only way we're going to have a chance to slow it down even a little bit is to all of us take our understand how serious it is and do our part. I now have over 1,000 views and 30 subscribers, which for an old white guy like me is going truly viral. When I said that to my wife, and she said, "Don't say going viral. It's really not a very good idea when we're talking about a virus." And until then, I didn't realize that. Yeah, you're right. It's not a really great analogy. But thank you for watching, and I'll be posting things probably every day. Hope you stay healthy.